Welcome, everybody. Got a good turnout today. Welcome to Wildlife for All's webinar, Beyond the North American Model. My name is Kevin Bixby. I am the founder and co-executive director of Wildlife for All. My co-executive director, Michelle Lute, is traveling today and could not join us. Can everybody hear me? I'm assuming so. You can, if not, put it in the Q&A and Natalie will let me know. Okay, for those of you who don't know, Wildlife for All is a national campaign to reform state wildlife management to be more democratic, just, compassionate, and focused on protecting wild species and ecosystems. We established Wildlife for All because it was becoming increasingly clear to many of us who care about wild animals and ecosystems that the status quo in wildlife management is incapable of addressing the extinction crisis and protecting the full range of wildlife diversity in the United States for historical, financial, and political reasons. And that for the status quo to change, we needed to look beyond the same specific issues that engage wildlife advocates in many states, killing contests, carnivore policies, trapping, etc., and address the underlying systemic reasons for why all of the states continue to prioritize hunting, fishing, and trapping above all else. If you'd like to learn more about us and sign up for our newsletter, check out our website, wildlifeforall.us. Our coalition now includes about 60 groups in more than 30 states. If you're interested in joining, please reach out to me or to Michelle. Many of you have asked if today's webinar will be recorded and available later for viewing. It is being recorded, and a link of the recording will be sent to all of you and posted on our website. I'd like to thank our intern, Natalie McMillan, who will be helping me today to try to keep me on task and keep everything going smoothly. Our speaker will talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Everybody's mic and camera should be turned off. You can post your questions at any time into the Q&A section. Natalie will help curate them, and we will then pose them to our speaker. I can't promise to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. Most of you probably have heard about the North American model. It is important to understand because it is considered sacrosanct by many in the wildlife management establishment. The views expressed by our speaker today do not necessarily align 100% with Wildlife for All's position on the North American model, which you can find on our website. And bring speaker, originally from Germany, Anja Heister of Missoula is a co-founder of Footloose Montana, a grassroots organization dedicated to protecting all wildlife and ending the nightmare of trapping on public lands. She holds a master's degree in biology from the Johann Wolfgang von Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany, and an interdisciplinary PhD specializing in wildlife conservation, ethics, and public policy from the University of Montana. So, Anja, I hand it over to you.
Okay. And congratulations, Kevin. Kevin, sounds like you're increasingly recruiting organizations to help, and that's the way to go. So yeah, thank you, Kevin, for inviting me, and thank you everyone for taking the time to be here today. Like Kevin said, I'm originally from Germany. I moved to Missoula, Montana in the spring of 2000. And although I'd been an animal rights activist all my life, I was not prepared for the extent of hunting and trapping in Montana, and in the entire US for that matter. And then something happened that really changed my life. And what happened was my partner, his son, and I, we were cross-country skiing through a national park, a national forest, right here outside of Missoula. And I'm so sorry. And when something caught our eyes, there was something big, dark, hanging in between the trees on our left side, and we had no idea what it was. So we took off our skis and we walked over there to see what it was. To our shock, it turned out to be a pine marten, a beautiful young female pine marten, beautiful brown fur. And she was just hanging there with her front paw caught in a leg-hold trap. And she was just hanging there, suspended in the air, with nowhere to hold on to. And it was a horrific sight. She was motionless. Her head was tilted to the side, did not move. There was a big pile of scat underneath her, which indicated that she probably had been hanging there for quite a while. And so we were able to cut the chain that was fastening the trap to the branch. And so we laid the animal on the ground in the snow. We covered her up with a jacket, and we got to work to remove the leg-hold trap. And the entire time, the pine marten was not moving at all. We actually thought she might have been dead by then. As we managed to take the leg-hold trap off. We pulled the jacket away from her slowly, and that's when she jumped up and ran away as fast as she could, ran away from us, and then she started limping. And then it happened. Then she stopped and she turned around. I still get goosebumps when I tell the story. She stopped, she turned around, and she looked at us. And by then, the three of us were in tears. And she looked at us for several seconds before she then turned around and disappeared into the woods. It was such a horrific and traumatic experience, quite frankly, that it really focused my attention on trapping. And then, so after that experience, it was just a matter of time before I found a group of people and I co-founded Footloose Montana. Then I wrote my dissertation on trapping, and then my book that was published in 2022. And so I wrote my book from the perspective of an animal rights advocate. And so the focus of my book is on the North American model of wildlife conservation. I'm going to call it model, or NAM. So the focus of my book is on that model with the goal of exposing the anthropocentrism, the belief in human superiority and entitlement that undergirds traditional wildlife management. So I started my book with a chapter on the animal perspective, or the animal standpoint theory, to set the tone, and also because it was important to me that we realize that we're not the only species that experiences the world and has a right to be in it. And this is especially important, I think, when we talk about the North American model. So here's a description that is aligned with my view, and I'm going to read it to you. The fact that animals, too, are conscious individuals, subjects of a life that matters to them, that can be better or worse for them, who can be benefited and harmed, that they are individuals with needs, beliefs, desires, preferences, and expectations, best accounts for the initial intuitions behind animal standpoint theory, that there is something that it is like to be a particular animal who experiences life and the world from a particular perspective, vantage, or standpoint from which life and the world are perceived and experienced, a perspective that is communicated in a variety of ways and that is informed by more or less complex needs, beliefs, preferences, desires, and emotions, also constitutes a suitable range of topics. So I believe when we apply the animal standpoint theory, when we go from there with other animals as subjects in mind, then we may ask important questions. What are the interests and needs of a wild animal independently from our own human interests. So then what is the North American model of wildlife conservation? The model represents the state government wildlife management system with hunting, fishing, and trapping as its cornerstones. As a Montana state official once said, quote, "You never see the model, but you sure know when you've violated it." And so a violation means, for example, critiquing hunting and trapping, right? So we do see it, actually. We do see the model at work in wildlife-related policies, regulations, and laws, in hunting, fishing, and trapping programs, the Pittman-Robertson Fund, and the general use attitude toward wild animals. So in order to understand the model, we need to take a quick look back in history, specifically between the 17th and 19th century. You're probably all familiar with European settlers engaging in the greatest slaughter of wildlife the continent had ever seen. The American bison was decimated from an estimated 30 to 60 million down to 1,000 individuals by 1890. The passenger pigeons were pretty much exterminated. Shot, killed from 3 to 5 billion down to 0 in a few decades. Actually, their last representative, Martha, the pigeon, died in captivity in 1914. And also, trappers killed tens of millions of beavers. And at 1900, by 1900, about 100,000 individual beavers remained. So also an enormous number of elk, deer, pronghorn, and bighorn sheep were killed, right? So it got so bad that sport hunters would arrive at their favorite hunting grounds only to find them empty. There were no more animals for them to shoot. And that is when Theodore Roosevelt and a small group of wealthy and influential sport hunters started organizing against market hunters. And then in 1897, they founded the Boone and Crockett Club, a trophy hunting organization headquartered right here in Missoula, Montana, where I happen to live. So this came at a time of great societal upheaval, and sportsmen faced the threat of society deciding to protect wild animals. There was the women's suffrage movement going on, a humane movement was in progress, and preservationism, spearheaded by John Muir, gained traction. So facing the threat, and the potential threat, I should say, by society demanding complete protection of wildlife and thus an end to hunting, Roosevelt and others came up with the concept of fair chase. And that maneuver helped them to create a new image of masculinity that promoted the attribute of self-restraint and made hunting socially acceptable. Roosevelt believed that hunting had a civilizing effect on men, and he advocated hunting as an outlet for men's aggressive impulses. So this was also the point in history when the transition from market hunting to sport and recreational hunting began, and Roosevelt and others succeeded in conserving wildlife and saving hunting. And just another quick word about Roosevelt. This is actually really about wolves. Roosevelt deserves credit as the president who saved more than 230 million acres of public lands, including national parks, wetlands, and wildlife refuges. However, the other part of his legacy is tied to his dedication to sport hunting. He was a committed trophy hunter, and so Roosevelt once even traveled to Africa with his son and shot over 11,400 wild animals, including elephants and lions. He believed that wolves are a plague and needed to be exterminated. His proclamation led to a nationwide massacre of killing wolves with horrific methods, guns, traps, poison, even burning wolves alive, and other horrific means. There was an estimated number of wolves here on this continent before European settlers arrived, and the estimates was sorry, that's the wrong number. The estimate was between 250,000 to about 2 million wolves. So by mid 20th century, there were only a few hundred individuals left. So at the end of the 19th century, the Boone and Crockett Club put laws into place that protect the freedom to hunt, placed wildlife into the ownership of the public, and government agencies were to manage wildlife in trust. They lobbied for the passages of the Pittman-Robertson Act in 1937 and the duck stamp. These sportsmen promoted the concept of fair chase, like I said, to make hunting socially acceptable. And they also created a new class of sportsmen that would hunt for recreation and not for food. And these sportsmen, I don't like the name sportsman, but I'm going to use it. Sportsmen structured varied forms of boards, commissions, and fish and game commissions to have a voice in the decision-making process. So I guess the takeaway message is here that state government-based wildlife conservation was established by historic sport hunters for hunters. So again, we see the ideas of Roosevelt and other historic sportsmen reflected in the 7 tenets or elements of the North American model. Number 1, wildlife. That means wildlife resources are a public trust. Wildlife is owned by the public and held in trust by governmental agencies for present and future human generations. Number 2, and you can read it yourself. Number 2 means commercial hunting and the sale of wildlife is prohibited to ensure the sustainability of wildlife populations, but it allows commercial fur markets and trade. Number 3 means that the surplus of wild animals is allocated to public by law, not by any forms of elitism. Number 4, wildlife can be killed only for a legitimate purpose. This sanctions killing wildlife for food, fur, self-defense, property protection, and personal use and recreation. Number 5 is wildlife is considered an international resource, pretty straightforward. It recognizes that wildlife needs to be protected across state lines and internationally. Number 6 is the science is the proper tool to discharge wildlife policy. A little cumbersome, but it means that science is to be the basis for wildlife policy. Number 7, democracy of hunting is standard, means that everyone has the opportunity to participate in hunting. This is also called the democracy of sport, and that's based on Aldo Leopold's thinking. So in 2011, Valerius Geist, a Canadian wildlife biologist, avid hunter and predator hater, suggested to combine these snapshots of historic thinking and actions taken, combine them and call them a model. And in 2024, this is what we're dealing with. So the conservation industrial complex echoes the military industrial complex, and that's a term coined by former US President Eisenhower in his farewell speech in 1961. Eisenhower warned the nation about the power of this emerging complex, referring to the close relations between the government's armed forces and the corporations that supply them. According to Eisenhower, the complex was not only leading to industry control of the government and economy, but it presented a serious threat to democratic governments. And this is what applies to the model. So the term iron quadrangle, love that word, was coined by a group of conservationists critical of the model, and it describes the entities that compose this complex and thereby imposing protective barriers for the public. So it consists of government agencies, it consists of sportsmen, primarily hunters and their associations, manufacturers of hunting, shooting, and trapping equipment and associated paraphernalia. And then lastly, policymakers. And so you can see there is an interdependency. And by the way, this diagram is my own creation, so it's not exactly what the original looks like, but you can see that there is an interdependency. And it is just like Eisenhower warned, though. Today, these entities really control the governmental run wildlife management, and they prevent democratic participation by us, the non-hunting public. So finally, this iron quadrangle shows that state wildlife agencies are not only beholden to the interests of sportsmen, but also to the industries and even to nonprofit organizations linked to hunting and trapping. So in my book, I actually placed the iron quadrangle within the even larger animal industrial complex. And that is a network of entities, corporations, industries, universities, etc., that are all reinforcing the belief that wild and domestic animals exist for us humans to use. And of course, they're all profiting from the exploitation of animals. So you might ask, why is this important? I think it is very important because it helps us to realize that there are a multitude of barriers. There's not only a barrier around the model, but there's a multitude of barriers that prevent democratic participation. It's also important because it gives us an idea of what we're up against, right? So overall, it is this network of powerful forces that aggressively opposes us every time when we, the public, tries to curtail or end certain hunting practices or trapping. So there's a lot of model propaganda going on out there. And some examples are Shane Mahoney. He's Canadian. He's also the spokesman of the model, and John Jackson III. And they both have infiltrated international government-related organizations that assess the risk of species extinctions and the international wildlife trade, so such as the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, and the Convention on International Trade on Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, CITES. They also are part of this organization called Conservation Force, and that organization has ties to the exotic animal hunting industries. And so, for example, one of their programs called Ranching for Restoration exploits a loophole in the Endangered Species Act to even further increase their profits. So Conservation Force has ties to the exotic animal hunting industry. There are tons of game ranches, mostly in Texas. And then, of course, a major player is the Safari Club International, the world's largest trophy hunting organization with probably around 50,000 members and 200 chapters representing all 50 states in the United States and 106 other countries. So the list of key players involved in spewing propaganda about the model goes on and on and on. It involves the states and the National Trappers Association, the NTA, the National Rifle Association, the NRA, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, professional wildlife associations, such as the Wildlife Society, the U.S. Sportsman Alliance, and finally, the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus with congressmen and women as members. And its Congressional Sportsman Foundation sits right in Washington, D.C. I'm pointing this way. And that Congressional Sportsman's Foundation in D.C. is probably the most powerful lobbying force for the model. So then, of course, here are other brands and corporate sponsors, all involved in various ways in the promotion of the model. So some takeaways from my research on the model is that the model narrative excludes the efforts of many other individuals and organizations that were all spearheading the protection of wild animals and their habitat at the time. The Audubon Society, for example, was highly influential at the time. Their efforts were indispensable for the passage of the Lacey Act in the Migratory Bird Treaty and the Endangered Species Act. And then there were individuals, women, for example, Rosalie Edge. She was a leading conservationist from New York. She lived from 1877 to 1962. She was a suffrage and an animal champion. And Rosalie Edge was so disgusted by the cruelty of bird hunters that she bought a 1,400-acre area. She banned the hunters, and she created the world's first sanctuary for raptors called Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania. Some of you might be familiar with that. That is, by the way, also the same sanctuary that helped Rachel Carson with the discovery of the horrendous effects of DDT on birds and other wild animals. And Rosalie Edge also led campaigns to create the Olympic National Park in Washington in 1938 and Kings National Park in California in 1940. However, the model narrative does not mention Rosalie Edge or any other female conservationist of the time, and there were many. The other takeaway is that the model is a special interest. The model is not law. It is just a set of principles without any grounding in law. The model fails to include a tenet on habitat. So it fails to include a principle focused on habitat and the role played by federal lands in the conservation of wildlife. It's a failure that makes any account of conservation history incomplete, to say the least. The model is not a product of consensus within the conservation community, and there is a lot of pushback, so to speak, among the conservation community. So instead, the NAM has been and continues to be endorsed, promoted, and aggressively disseminated by a subgroup of wildlife management professionals, along with influential sportsmen's groups and trophy hunting organizations and governmental agencies. Remember the wildlife industrial complex. And their conclusion was that the model is a special interest that competes directly and indirectly with other conservation ideals and organizations with non-consumptive or anti-hunting values. Another takeaway is that the NAM is an obstacle to other approaches. So the NAM hinders the development of more compassionate, justice-based, and holistic approaches to conservation. For example, the model vehemently opposes animal rights, naturally, compassionate conservation, and an approach to conservation that is not species-specific. Michael Soleil, the grandfather of conservation, clearly perceived conservation biology and wildlife management as differing in goals when he founded the Society for Conservation Biology in 1985 in part due to the need for a more holistic approach that would address the entire spectrum of conservation challenges threatening the conservation of biodiversity. And he was right. And I should have said the late Michael Soleil. He was right. The sixth species extinction is going on right now, with 1 million of plant and animal species estimated to go extinct over the next decade. The extinction crisis is occurring at the same time as the model is in existence. I'm not saying it is caused by the model, but it clearly is happening. The extinction crisis is happening while the NUM is in charge, so to speak. Another takeaway is that the model is inadequate because of the funding source. Hunters can no longer claim that they are the main funders of Pittman and Robertson monies. More than 70% of the revenues that go into the Pittman-Robertson Fund come from non-hunting related sources, such as general funds, lottery receipts, speeding tickets, and taxes from general sales, outdoor recreation equipment, and income tax checkoffs, and other sources. So also interesting to note is that the dominant segment of contributors to the Pittman-Robertson Fund are now not male young hunters anymore, but young female urban target shooters who are not hunters. Pretty interesting. So the public, just a word about the public, how much and how much the public actually contributes to conservation. And I'm one of them. You are part of this. Membership fees, donations to non-hunting organizations. That's how we contribute to conservation, through membership fees, donations to non-hunting organizations protecting wild animals and their habitat. We contribute through fees, donations to the National Park Service that supports the public land system and benefits wild animals. Many people, rather selflessly, are engaged in wildlife rehabilitation, and they contribute financially, or they volunteer for organizations that have no hunting and or trapping agendas. So there's a study that showed that the public has funded approximately 95% of annual costs of the $18.7 billion associated with federally managed lands. Pretty amazing. The vast majority of lands the vast majority of lands in the National Wildlife Refuge System were acquired through means not related to hunting. So we already talked about the boundaries, but I just wanted to emphasize this one more time. A takeaway is that because the model was set up by hunters for hunters, the structure serves sportsmen and they keep the public out. A common attitude among sportsmen is that, quote, wildlife management is a sportsman domain. I don't know how many times I have heard that when I've gone to commission meetings. So from resources provided to promote hunting and trapping as the priority use of wildlife, the structure of laws, regulations, and policies, to the power given to states, governors, directors, and their commissions. It all leads to the same conclusion. The system is set up to serve hunters and trappers and to keep the non-hunting public out. So in addition, as already talked about, the model is part of the conservation industrial complex, which is situated within the larger animal industrial complex. They all reject that individual animals have intrinsic value, and they all benefit from animal exploitation. So the takeaway message is here that our advocacy triggers an aggressive response by entities within these two complexes. The model fails ecosystems. the model's bias on huntable animal species ignores other species not of interest to sportsmen. Also, state wildlife agencies sometimes introduce or I should say, maintain invasive, so-called invasive species, such as feral pigs, or they dump millions of non-native fish into waterways to increase hunting and fishing opportunities. Actually, state wildlife agencies go to extreme lengths to please hunters. So an example is the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks spends about $1 million to release around 50,000 pen-raised, ring-necked pheasants for hunters to shoot. It's atrocious. But here, it does not matter, apparently, that the pheasants are not native animals to the US. The late predator ecologist John Landry, I probably don't pronounce that name correctly, John Landry stated that the continued support by hunters for introducing exotic animals into ecosystems disqualifies hunters from calling themselves conservationists. So the model's bias on huntable animal species, as mentioned, neglects other species who need to be supported and their habitat protected. For example, salamanders, snakes, bees, hummingbirds. It promotes trapping of beavers, the natural engineers of ecosystems. So when conservation conflicts with hunters' interests, the detrimental effects of an overabundance of white-tailed deer are overlooked, while predators are killed and their ecosystem services are ignored. And that goes against the best available science that shows that predators play vital roles for the functioning of ecosystems. And also, finally, given the self-regulating ability of top carnivores, it also shows that not only is hunting of predators not needed, but it also disrupts the animal's social interactions through which self-regulation is achieved. The science of the model is what I call selective. It's a selective science in service of exploitation of wild animals for hunting and trapping. It relies on concepts like the maximum sustainable yield, which is defined as, quote, the greatest harvest that can be taken from a self-generating stock of animals year after year, while still maintaining a constant average size of the stock, end of quote. Gotta love that language. The model science manipulates the game wildlife populations and their habitats to create a, quote, shootable surplus of animals. And that goes back to Aldo Leopold. It focuses on slaughtering predators, bears, mountain lions, coyotes, and wolves. And again, ignores their ecological values to stable ecosystems or to the stability of ecosystems, and it ignores their self-regulating abilities. It destroys the social fabric of wild animal families and communities, and ignores that wild animals are deeply embedded in the ecosystems they live in. So here's a diagram that I put together a while back that just shows the flow of how the science works, the goal of exploitation of wild animals. The science is strongly utilitarian, strongly anthropocentric, has an instrumental attitude, and it manipulates animal populations and their habitat to generate the surplus, and it entails violence against individual animals in form of hunting, fishing, and trapping. The ethics of the model is, again, what I call selective ethics in service of exploitation of wild animals for hunting and trapping. It ignores the social values of compassion, our social values of compassion and concern for individual animals, and the science that shows mammals, birds, and other animals as are conscious, sentient, feeling and thinking beings with capabilities equal or oftentimes superseding those of humans. It assumes that humans have the right to lethally use other animals. In this case, sportsmen have the right to kill wild animals, even for the most frivolous reasons, such as recreation. It looks only at the whole. What counts is the species and the populations, while ignoring the intrinsic value of individual animals. Actually, the individual animal is viewed as replaceable, renewable. The model's ethics has reduced sentient wild animals to the status of natural renewable resources serving human interests. They have reduced sentient animals to human property. And overall, they are viewed as living targets, objects instead of subjects, things that have no rights. As a sportsman once said, quote, "To the sportsman, the death of the game is not what interests him. One does not hunt in order to kill. One kills in order to have hunted." I think it doesn't get any more callous, entitled, and anthropocentric than that. So again, here's a diagram of how the ethics works. Yeah, so to justify the exploitation of other animals, again, strongly utilitarian, strongly anthropocentric, with an instrumental attitude. It focuses on the whole. It ontologizes animals as natural renewable resources and as property for use. It also separates, the model insists on a separation between humans and non-human animals, and that is very detrimental. There's a certain disconnect that the model's relationship presents to us, a disconnect to other living beings, and there's certainly a lack of emotions. There's also certainly violence against individual animals. So speaking of violence, I think this might be the last takeaway. The model uses violence against wild animals to meet frivolous interests of sportsmen. I call them frivolous interests of sportsmen. And there's truly a war going on, and it's brutal out there. I've dedicated a whole chapter to the violence and cruelty inherent in wildlife management, especially hunting and trapping, in my chapter titled Crime Scenes in the Woods. And I address the brutality of spring bear hunts, wildlife killing contests, vehicle killing and coyote whacking, prairie dog shooting, massacre of wolves, and of course, trapping. The model uses language that conceals these brutal actions and suppresses empathy. And I think we should not use their choice of terms. The term game, for example, implies killing is a game and that the animal participates as an equal. This is not true, obviously. The word harvest always gets me. It is killing. When we use the word harvest, it means that animals are nothing else than a plot of grass, of wheat, where every animal or every grass is the same, replaceable. It's all the same, right? So using it and not he or she objectifies and makes the animal genderless. Natural resources, that term conceals sentience. Natural renewable resources makes the individual animal completely disappear. And then lastly, the word legal. When we talk about legal hunting, or when they talk about legal hunting, legal trapping, that term prevents us from recognizing that hunting and trapping entails cruelty and violence, reflective of aggressive, destructive, and violent human behavior. So the World Health Organization actually views violence as the result of the complex interplay of individuals, relationships, social, cultural, and environmental factors, and it treats violence as a public health issue of global dimension. Today, we know that violence does not occur in isolation. Violent and oppressive systems, and the model is one of them, reinforce each other because they have the same root, a socially constructed hierarchy worldview that increases violence regardless of who the violence is perpetrated against, other animals, humans, or the environment. On the other hand, empathy and compassion are the moral glue that holds our societies together. And I think that the violent acts of harming and killing of unsuspecting, unoffending, and defenseless animals should be of great social concern to us, particularly in the era of incredible environmental destruction, accelerating plant and animal extinctions, and climate change. In my chapter, I talk quite a bit about the intersectionality of violence. So I don't know where we are time-wise, but I'm getting to the end. I'm coming to the end. So contrast the model to the approach of compassionate conservation. A compassionate conservation approach aims to safeguard Earth's biological diversity while retaining a commitment to treating individuals with respect and concern for their well-being. I think it doesn't get any better. It brings empathy and compassion into the decision-making and policy developing process. It rejects the notion of wild animals as, quote, natural renewable resources, and instead treats them as sentient beings with needs and interests that need to be protected. And finally, it creates or helps us it creates a relationship with wild animals that's motivated by pro-social emotions such as love, empathy, and compassion. And so again, if we applied compassion to conservation, we might ask questions like, what do wild animals need from us? Usually it's the other way around. What do we want from them? So the four tenets of compassionate conservation are: one, first, do no harm. That principle is adopted from the Hippocratic Oath and means that we need to be careful when we intervene and do good instead of harm. Two, individuals matter. It acknowledges the intrinsic value of individual wild animals and rejects the killing of individual animals. Three, inclusivity of all wild animals. That principle acknowledges the intrinsic value of both the individual and the collective they belong to, whether we label them as abundant, native, non-native, invasive, etc. Number four, peaceful coexistence. This calls for recognition that our interactions with wild animals should not be based in aggression and violence, but compassion, and it helps us to coexist with other beings. So this, I think, is almost my final slide. It's called The Need for a Non-Anthropocentric Ethical Foundation, a Global Perspective. The 2020 Living Index, commissioned by the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, documented a 68% decline in the sizes of birds, mammals, fish, and reptiles since 1970. We also know that the interconnected web of life is getting smaller and increasingly frayed. We also know that 1 million animal and plant species are in imminent danger of extinction, many within the next few decades. Humans make up less than 1% of the approximately 8.7 million species that we know of. Yet we already use up more than 25% of all photosynthesis on Earth. Approximately 5% of the world's habitable land is already used for agriculture, predominantly for so-called livestock. I don't like that word either, but so for livestock, cows, pigs, sheep, and so forth and so forth, and for crops that feed both the animals and people. Meat consumption is the leading cause of biodiversity loss and a major contributor to climate change. I think the time for change is now. So, in summary, the model has long historic roots that are firmly planted in colonialism, patriarchy, and anthropocentrism and speciesism. I'm not going to go through the entire list. but I'm going to select a few. It has a false, non-inclusive narrative of the history of conservation. It responds only to sportsmen and causes division among the public. It has selective ethics and science. It's a special interest. And the model has hijacked governmental agencies, and today it serves trapping and entire trophy hunting industries, nationally and globally. And I believe that the model is failing all of us, non-human animals, humans, ecosystems, and the entire planet.
Thank you,
So,
Anja.
yeah,
We have some
yeah. I know
questions.
I'm over time a little bit.
That's fine. It was worthwhile. Let me try and get to a couple questions before we run out of time. Susan Holmes says, thank you, Anja. Can you point to countries which have a successful model of wildlife conservation? Are there good models currently being implemented that we can learn from?
That's a very good question, Susan. And honestly, I haven't looked at other countries in quite a while. Um, what was I going to say? Europe doesn't have the best model either. That's for sure. Australia is starting to implement more and more compassionate conservation projects. So I would direct you, Susan, to Australia, specifically to the Center for Compassionate Conservation in Sydney, Australia.
Thank you. Francisco Santiago Avila has a question. Thank you for sharing all this valuable information and your insights. Given your takeaway that the NAM is set up to exclude non-consumptive users, what policy strategies can wildlife animal advocacy organizations deploy to affect institutional change rather than focus on smaller changes such as restricting hunting seasons a few months, prohibiting certain traps or hunting methods? And then what are your thoughts on when direct action and civil disobedience come in?
Okay, I'm gonna respond to the latter part of your question first. I'm a big believer in civil disobedience. And I think that it is really necessary today for various reasons. We need to raise awareness of the atrocities that are happening out there through hunting, fishing, and trapping. And civil disobedience is often the way to go, and so is direct action. So I'm a big supporter of both. Um, what was the first part of the policy strategies? I really think that we need to come together, and Wildlife for All is just doing just that. We need to come together, all the conservation organizations, even animal rights organizations, the rights for nature. We should come together and agree on the intrinsic value of individual animals, that hunting and trapping should end. And we need to speak in one voice, and we need to show a wave of resistance that literally overwhelms the existing systems. I think that's how we can achieve change.
Thank you, Anja. That's a great plug for Wildlife for All, because that's exactly what we're trying to do. Jazz Phillips asks, in one or two sentences, how would you respond to those who belittle compassion for wildlife and change in wildlife management by calling us emotional?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I have been to so many commission meetings and so forth, and I have never ever experienced more emotional individuals than at these meetings. And those were hunters and trappers. Every time a member from the public dares to critique hunting and trapping, they just come up and they're so emotional, and they jump up and yell at people. And I mean, it's unbelievable. So telling me that or telling us that sportsmen are not emotional, and sometimes out of control is ludicrous, really. And secondly, emotions are so important. Emotions allow us to survive. Empathy and compassion are the glue that holds our societies together. We don't, in our human-to-human relationships, we don't only value rationality. We greatly value understanding. We greatly value love, empathy, compassion. So why should that be different? Why should our relationship with other animals, in this case wild animals, be any different?
Thank you. Anonymous asks, can you talk a bit about how you see tribal or indigenous hunting for subsistence and cultural and ceremonial purposes fitting into this conversation? What have you learned from any dialogue you've had with tribal folks about the NAM?
Right, right. I have to say I don't have much experience with conversations with tribal members. I do know that a lot of them really oppose the slaughter of predators. Subsistence hunting is an issue for me because on one hand I realize that I live in an urban area. I have lots of food choices and so forth, and that may not be true for animals. For for humans are animals too, but for tribal tribes who live more remotely, I do think that a lot of tribes respect individual animals much more than we Westerners could ever do. However, I also realize that traditions have changed over time, and they are no longer the traditions that were present, let's say, in the 1900s or in the 1800s. You know, I mean, so we need to look at that too. So, from my personal perspective, I oppose all killing of animals, period. But the vast majority of killing is done by people who don't need to kill, and we do it anyway. And I think that is the problem.
No, thank you. Let's see, for folks who have raised their hands, can you type into the your question into the Q&A section? I realize it's not going to be possible if you're on the phone, but so Lori Freitas asked, would it be better to affect change at the state level or federal level?
For some reason, I think on the federal level. And I just want to say that I'm not a policy strategist or policy expert, you know. But I think again we need to come together. Our side is so fractured. Some believe in hunting, some believe only in some believe in trophy hunting, and some believe in whatever, you know. So we need to come to a consensus and achieve change. And I believe that on the federal, we're probably going to be more effective on the federal level.
Thank you. I'll just add my 2 cents. The federal level is important, but in the United States, the states have primary legal jurisdiction over wildlife within their borders. The exceptions are species that are listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act or protected by the Migratory Treaty Act, Bird Treaty Act. But for the most part, it's the states that control wildlife policy in the United States, which is why Wildlife for All focuses on the state level. Let's see, just my 2 cents. Well, we have a lot of questions.
Hopefully that doesn't mean that I was so unclear, you know.
No. I think a lot of these are very thoughtful on. Weldon Bosworth asked, what are your thoughts on how agencies rationalize wildlife killing contests as a legitimate use of wildlife under the North American model?
I think it's atrocious, and it sheds an even worse light on the model. You know, the model is already really bad and needs to go. But justifying wildlife killing contests is, in my view, nothing other than kill for the thrill, kill for the thrill. And it's appalling. It's absolutely appalling.
Yes, thank you. Oh boy. Okay, somebody asked, will this be recorded? I did announce at the beginning that it is being recorded, and a link will be sent around and posted to our website. And I'm going to go with Pamela Williams for the last question. I'm sorry for all the other questions that we didn't get to. Where is Anja's book available for purchase?
Oh, that's a great question. First of all, I do not profit from selling this book, selling my book. Unfortunately, I wished I did. It's available at wherever you usually buy books. Hate to mention Amazon, but it is available on Amazon, through Palgrave Macmillan, the publisher, through, what is it called, Abe Books, or Thrift Books, I believe. It is also available. So there are many venues where you could get my book. I have to warn you, it is still pretty expensive, sadly. The publisher is promoting it as a textbook, so it's quite pricey, unfortunately. But thank you for
Well,
that question.
I hope it gets used as a textbook.
Yeah, yeah. And I should probably say something. At the beginning, when I went through the 7 tenets of the model, I thought I might be running out of time, and I didn't realize that that this was going to be recorded. So there are some missing titles of some of the first few tenets that I didn't mention, because I thought everybody could look at it, look at them on the screen, but clearly that was a mistake on my part. So,
well, it's a short time to cover a lot of content.
yeah.
But again, you can go on the Wildlife for All website. We do have information about the North American model. We actually have a previous webinar that we did, I think 2 years ago, about the model. So more information there. So I want to thank you, Anja, for your time today and your insights. And I want to thank all of you who joined today. And
Yes, thank
we'll see
you.
you next time.
Okay.
Bye.
Goodbye, and thank you for your work.